I guess everybody knows me. I'm Christine Clark. Kicked it away from that. My privilege to introduce to you Eileen Pronsolino, the Queen of Greenwood Ridge and Shingle Ridge. And today is her 74th wedding anniversary. She decided to give her time up at home and come and tell us everything she knows about wine, and probably more than that even. So anyway, Eileen.
Wow.
Well, I hope you'll bear with me. I'm going to sit while I read this.
Do you want to use your preferred chair here, maybe?
What? Oh, no, this is fine. I'm going to skip over a little bit of the first part of this article that we wrote back in 1989 deals with the history of Anderson Valley. So I'm just going to kind of skip over it because we all know Anderson Valley was settled by Walter Anderson's family in 1851. From that point on, people came, the group of newcomers that were Swiss came shortly after Walter Anderson did. And they knew that we know that the Swiss were wine drinkers, but nobody could find any history about whether or not they ever planted vineyards to sell wine or whether they just made enough for their own use. They have found old vineyards in the valley. On the Guntley Ranch, there's some old vines that Bobby Clever said at one point that vines looked like they were about 100 years old. But beyond that, the history is pretty much starts with when the Italian when Italy was having a bad time, and so many of the Italian immigrants immigrated to this country. Lots of them came to California to grow grapes, and a lot of them brought grapes with them. The plants. They've never really been able to trace back the beginning of the Zinfandel vine, and they call it a Zinfandel, but they really don't know what the true DNA of it is. They're still working on it. And the first vineyards that were planted up the Greenwood Ridge were all done by the Italian immigrants. And there was Angelo Frati and John Frati and the Giovanettis, the Tabanis, Ronaldis, the Lesbies, and they all planted. John Pardini actually was the one who said he was going to plant on the ridge top rather than flat land up there because the soil in Italy was better on the ridge tops, and the slant of the hills gave them better sun exposure and better sugar. The problem with grapes in the valley at that point, they were trying to grow red grapes, and we had too much fog on the valley floor and too much frost in the spring, and it often killed the crops. So apples were the main crop that they had on the valley floor. So the original varieties that were grown were Mr. Giovanetti planted Alicante, Zinfandel, and this was all up on what is now, pardon me, the Hagerman Ranch. He accidentally planted onto the Hagerman Ranch, not knowing where the lines were, and so when Hagerman had it surveyed, he told Mr. Giovanetti that he could have the crop for 5 years, and then the land would revert back to him. Then he had just the Alicante and the Zinfandel. And from everything I've been told, Zinfandel makes a wonderful wine. I mean, I like Zinfandel's juice, but if they add 5% of Alicante to it, it makes it a smoother wine. So that's why you find a lot of Alicante in the old vineyards. And I know the kids used to like to play in them because the Alicante has red juice, and they used to shoot them with BBs. Have a good time with them. But Riesling, Malvasia Blanco, and Sweetwater grapes were basically the white grapes that were grown up. I've never seen a Malvasia Blanco. We had Malvasias in our vineyard, and it was all red grapes. So I really don't know what the Blanco was. I don't think I've ever seen one. After World War I, most of the year before World War I is when most of the Italians were here, and they planted their grapes. The selling of the grapes, the selling of the wine, was a little bit of a hardship because there was no really any good roads, now in the Anderson Valley. So that's why all the apples that were grown in the valley at that point were dried first because of having to wait and make it ship easier. Find my place here. Several of the winemakers built stills, produced drop of brandy, prices accordingly higher. Since several of the school districts in the Anderson Valley had voted to outlaw the sale of alcoholic beverages in their areas by 1914, both Boonville and Navarro were dry, and the saloons were out of business. Business on Vinegar Hill must have been brisk. The success of the Greenwood Ridge Vineyards planting led to plantings in other areas. At one point, out on the Fish Rock Road, they said there was about 150 acres of Zinfandel planted out there. There's still quite a few out there, but I don't know what the acreage is now. In fact, I think Christine brought a new map with her today to show you where all the vineyards are to this day. The Italian-American families found similar suitable conditions for growing grapes and making wine as they had in Italy. There may have been as much as 150 acres of wine grapes growing on the Fish Rock Area Road, Mendocino County, Durham Ward 1 area, and portions of 2 of the high elevation vineyards, about 14 acres in all, survived and produced high quality Zinfandel to this day. We're above the fog line. And like this morning, you probably had fog here in the valley. We had beautiful clear skies up there on the hill. So we don't, Vinegar Ridge, or Greenwood Ridge, is at, where we live, is at 1,200 feet. The Hageman Ranch is below us, maybe 150, 200 feet, but they still, the Fratties had wonderful grapes there. And in Bootling, wine is referred to as Stratishams. So that was my husband's aunt and uncle. Ridges weren't the only places to be planted during the early years of the 20th century. The Pinoli family began buying property in the Mill Creek, Lazy Creek area behind Philo and Navarro, and they planted grapes on the sloping hillsides above the creeks. Joe Pinoli began planting his vineyards in 1911 and 1912, and it is said he founded the first bonded winery in the valley. John and Charles Pinoli bought land nearby and began planting grapes in 1917. Zinfandel, Alicante, and Sweetwater were the varieties chosen for their venture. These vineyards situated on a warm south-facing slope, surviving the frost that showed that wine grapes planted in the valley could at least grow to maturity. One of the things about being the first bonded winery in the valley, Margaret Levan said they were the first bonded winery on Greenwood Ridge. And this was before the Prohibition, and they had their bonding number was still painted on the tanks that she had in her barn. She was always going to give me a picture, but she didn't. But she did go to the BTAF and ask to get copies of the original bonding papers, and they informed her that they had no use for them, so they had all been burned when Prohibition went into effect. So she never got any papers.
Could you say what bonding means?
That's what you register with the Bureau of Alcohol and Tobacco. It's a license a federal license. I guess it's somebody may have a better description than I do, but that's all I can say. Any of you school teachers know?
Put them to the test, right?
Taxes. It involves taxes.
It's just as things were looking up for the Anderson Valley growers and their wineries, Prohibition brought down the curtain. It was one thing to work around the local ban on the sale of alcoholic beverages, quite another to take on the federal government. By 1921, making and selling wine had become a federal offense. Federal agents were calling on winery owners with axes. Although some of the older residents could speak little English, they soon got to the point. Olga Tavani recalls that federal governments coming to their place and smashing their families' wine barrels with axes. And because it was up on a hill and the wine was running down the hill, the kids grabbed everything they could as far as containers and were down there catching the wine as it flowed down the hill. But the thing about it was, they said before the federal agents came, the sheriff used to come over every year. He spoke no Italian, so he always took a high school kid with him who spoke both English and Italian. So the Italian families would just tell the feds or the sheriff what they told the kids. And so they said, we don't have any wine, nothing there, but they were still selling wine in Billy John's and taking it to Mendocino, Fort Bragg, and up there. But how they got away with it, nobody's ever able to tell me. You did see a lot of stills throughout the valley where grappa was made. We still got an old one sitting on our place that Robert Shaini had. According to the accounts, the raids did put a great deal of pressure on the families, and they stopped winemaking altogether for a while. Most of the old winemakers still sold wine and grappa through the back door. Hard times in the lumber industry and the fear of the federal action certainly clouded the outlook for the local wine industry throughout 1920s and 30s. Many vineyardists lost their vines let their vines fall into neglect and told them to make for room for orchards and open grazing land. Some sold their land and moved on to other parts of California. Still, there were a few people who believed the future would be brighter. The Cameron party, and the Cameron family, who was the original owners of the vineyard that we owned up on the Grima Ridge, and then John Pardini bought it from him, was where they planted the first ones on the very ridge top for the slope. They said Cameron family said the ridgetop land to sold the ridgetop land to John and Rosie Pardini in 1922. Despite the recently enacted prohibition, the Pardinis planted some vineyards. The family cellar was soon converted to a winery where John made 3 wines. Bruna, John Pardini's daughter, said that she liked the pink wine, which was a blend of a Zinfandel and one of the white grapes. The house burned down in 1927 or 28. John built a new house nearby and continued to make wine in the cellar of the old house. By the time Prohibition ended as a national experiment in 1933, winemaking and wine growing and making had undergone much eclipse that it could not recover from. The railroad that had once brought lumbermen and their families up Greenwood Creek for weekends of camping, music, and drinking wine is only a memory. When they speak of the railroad, my great uncle worked in Elk, and they had hand cars that came up Greenwood Creek and up Elk Creek. And the one that came up Greenwood Creek land stopped at the creek just behind where my mother-in-law's house is now. And they used to, I guess they had several hand cars, I don't know, he never explained, but he said they'd stop at the first place they came to and buy a jug of wine and a loaf of bread and head on down to the Hagerman Ranch. Because the Hagerman Ranch had built a dance hall. Yeah. And they spent the whole weekend there partying and having a good time and came back and took the hand cars back to Elk to go to work. Almost the only thing that improved during the 1930s was transportation. Public roads were being upgraded as part of the Get America Back to Work projects, and Anderson Valley got a good all-weather surfaced road. For the few growers left in the valley and surrounding ridges, this meant that grapes could be trucked and sent to the wineries in Cloverdale and other northern Sonoma communities. The Panolis began selling their to Bandera, and Segaso instead of making their own wines, and the other growers did the same. Weather took its toll on the vines too. In the 1940s, saw a number of killing frosts that had hit hard. Even in the oldest vineyards, the Pronsolino family, which had bought the neighboring Pardini place in 1944, had to pull out the 50-year-old vines from its old home vineyard in 1949 because of the frost-induced loss. John Pardini's choice of well-drained hilltop site had proved to be the wise one. The 5+ acre block of Zinfandel planted by the Pardini family in 1922 is still producing award-winning wine grapes. And we sold, my mother-in-law sold it to the, Darren Edvies in 1976. And their name was Duprat, and they renamed the Duprat Vineyards. It went through a lot of families, one family after another, and it's back in the family now. My 2 nephews in Santa Rosa own the vineyard. Yeah. And I think that he said that Copain is making the wine from it, and the Zinfandels are still winning all kinds of awards. So, the post-World War II area was an exciting time in Anderson Valley. The housing boom in the post-war years hit Mendocino County square in the timberland, and that was just fine with the loggers, mill workers, and timber landowners. For the first time in the decades, more people were coming into the valley to work than were leaving. Philo, Navarro, and Boonville each supported several sawmills and stores, gas stations, and their bars prospered. One business that was not improved was the wine grape growing. The newcomers were mostly from the heartland of America, and like the original white settlers, had no tradition of wine drinking. Most of the vineyards fell into neglect, and acreage continued to drop. At the time that Dr. Edmeades came in to plant what is known as the Edmeades Vineyard, the John Pinoli Vineyard and our vineyard were the only ones left. Yeah, we're still producing good grapes. The only exception in this trend was the experiment conducted by Italian Swiss Colony, a winery located in the northern Sonoma County of Asti. This colony was looking to expand. It went on to become a giant in the winemaking industry in the 1950s and 60s, and figured that nearby Anderson Valley was a promising location. In 1946, the company and its associated growers bought 200 acres of the first land, of flatland, where Anderson Valley High School is presently located, and began planting about 100 acres of Unge Blanc in French Colombard the following year. The Italian Swiss colony also signed contracts with a number of Anderson Valley landowners, guaranteeing to buy their grapes for 15 years. Colony agreed to pay freight charges plus $2 per ton premium if they would plant certain high-yield varieties. Several valley owners accepted the colony's offer. Among them was Ranker Rickard, who planted 10 acres, 5 each of Golden Chassels and Kerrigan, on his ranch just north of Boonville. Unfortunately, things didn't go so well at the colony or its growers. The company had guessed wrong on its varietals, and most of them were never in great demand at the winery. But the biggest problem was that the grapes had never developed enough sugar to satisfy the colony's need. At that time, many wineries were looking to harvest grapes that were extremely high in sugar content, very ripe or mature, in order to make a sweeter wine popular in those days. Anderson Valley, with its coastal marine-influenced weather, just couldn't deliver. Cool evenings and warm days yielded fruit with relatively high acid and moderate sugar. Worse yet, the fruit ripened slowly and late, often falling victim to early autumn rains before harvest. Springtime was no better. The low-lying vineyards in the colony had most growers planted were hit by repeated frosts, and the only method of frost protection at the time was expensive, the often ineffective smudge pot. Some of the damage that was attributed to the first frost was later found to be the result of phylloxera infestations. Mendocino County Farm Advisor Bruce Bearden reported that he saw considerable evidence of damage from these pesky root lice when he examined Anderson Valley's vineyards for the first time in 1954. He speculated that the insect pests had been brought into the valley on the roots of the young vines planted in 1947, with economics and nature were united against it. The thing that we found out is our vineyard is still thriving. We have a small vineyard down the hill from it, and my nephew has another small vineyard down the hill from it. We all have cuttings off of the original vineyard. My nephews had bought grapevines and planted another spot next to the ones from the original cuttings, and they all died of Pronsolino, but it never infested the cuttings that we had grown ourselves. So they really use that. Now they're really looking into it for a good root stock that is resistant to phylloxera. Whether it will be everywhere, we don't know. With economics and nature united against it, the first post-war wine grapes experiment in the valley was a failure. Colony sold its 100-acre experiment to Anderson Valley School District about a decade after it began, and most growers pulled out their vines. Rickard harvested the last grapes on his ranch in 1973 and pulled the vines. Colony sold off the remaining 100 acres for residential use about the same time. Only one small block of vines, then owned by the Goodhue family, remains from this ambitious attempt to reestablish Anderson Valley as a wine-growing area. The modern era of wine growing and winemaking in Anderson Valley began in 1964. That was the year that Dr. Donald Edmeades, a Southern California physician, planted 24 acres of premium wine grapes and hung up a sign that read, "Edmeades Folly." Judging from the experiment, the Edmeades sign was not just self-depreciating humor. However, the doctor had experts, if not experience, on his side. Viticulturists from the University of California at Davis had recently completed a study of Anderson Valley. They had concluded that with the right varietals, Anderson Valley had the soil and climate to be a successful premium wine growing area. No matter that the valley was one of the coolest and certainly the rainiest areas, with the highest probability of frost damage and the low potential for ripeness, the UC Davis experts recognized some of the limitations of Anderson Valley's climate when they classified the valley region number 1, Philo or lower end, and cool region number 2 at the upper end, the Boudeville end. Edmeades decided to hedge his bet and planted 4 wine grape varieties. Gewürztraminer was one of those recommended by UC Davis as well as suited to this climate, and French Colombard, Chardonnay, Dukes were expected to do fairly well. Edmeades' real gamble was in choosing Cabernet Sauvignon as his major red variety. Cabernet is noted for being a slow-ripening grape, one that needs more than average heat to mature. The skeptics, of whom were many in the valley, sat and waited for Edmeades' folly to fulfill its prediction, while the young vines grew towards maturity. Within a few years, Edmeades' gamble had company. Tony and Gretchen Hutch bought 21 acres adjoining and planted Chardonnay and Gewürztraminer. The Hushes gambled on a different way. They bought a parcel of land high on the Greenwood Ridge, betting that the success of the early Italian winemakers was no fluke. And the couple planted an 8-acre vineyard with blocks of Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, and white Riesling. They crushed the first ripe crop, they've crushed the first ripe fruit from their valley vineyard in 1971, founding the Hush Vineyards, Anderson Valley's first bonded winery since Prohibition. For the first 3 years, Dr. Edmeades sold the fruit from his family wine to wineries outside the valley. He soon decided to crush and ferment the wine grapes on his own, although the doctor himself did not live to see the dream of producing his own wine come true. His son Darren guided the fledgling winery through the first crush in 1972. With 2 family wineries producing premium wines from the high-quality fruit, the modern renaissance of American wine, of Anderson Valley wine as a wine-producing era got underway. Winemaking efforts of the 1970s are not carried out on grand scale or with its state-of-art equipment. Both Hush and Edmeades used makeshift facilities and equipment for their wineries. A remodeled chicken coop and an old apple dryer respectively. I don't know what he means by that. Early tasting rooms were placed where customers were so novel that they might have to wait 15 minutes for someone to show up to open a bottle of wine for them. The quantity of wine the 2 pioneer Anderson Valley wineries produced was small, with bottlings of less than 100 cases, not all unusual. Having such limited scale production turned out to be fortunate for Anderson Valley's under-equipped winemakers, as Tony Hush discovered during the hard freeze in the winter of 1972 and 73. It got so cold that Hush resorted to using electric blankets to protect the wine as it fermented in wooden barrels. Improvisation, along with the trial and error, characterized these early years. And I can very well remember 72 and 73. The frost lasted for 2 weeks. I think every water pump in Anderson Valley blew up. They just,
How cold was it?
it got down to 7. So it was not very much fun. Yeah. Still, the quality of the early Anderson Valley wines showed promise and encouraged others to try their hands at winemaking. Within a few years, Ted Bennett and Deborah Kahn had planted vineyards across the highway from Edmeades and began producing wine under their Navarro Vineyards label. Realizing that the Mendocino coast was a good place to sell wines to affluent visitors, Edmeades and Navarro put their heads together in 1976 and created the Mendel Wine Guild. The guild was a cooperative arrangement with its own label appearing on wines produced by each of the 2 wineries. These wines were sold at a guild tasting room located above the delicatessen on Main Street in the town of Mendocino. Hundreds of tourists climbed the staircase to the cozy second-floor tasting room to sip wine and enjoy the view. Among the novel offerings at the Mendocino Wine Guild were several apple wines made by Edmeades and a variety of grape juices produced by Navarro. Along with the Mendocino Wine Guild experiment lasted only a year or so. It helped make Anderson Valley wines an important part of the visitors scene in Mendocino and introduced them to many vacationers for the first time. In returning home through the valley, coastal visitors began stopping at the wineries for newly discovered wine to take home. During the 70s, Edmeades introduced several other innovations to California wine business, including reproductions of watercolored paintings by local artists on its labels. Proprietary wines were big sellers for Edmeades, with its Rain wine, Whale wine, Queen Anne's Lace, and Opal breaking new ground on the marketplace. Edmeades entered several years of turmoil restructuring during the early 1980s and ultimately ceased production altogether. Kendall Jackson Vineyards and Winery of Lake County purchased Edmeades in 1988. This gave the pioneer winery a new life as part of growing Anderson Valley sparkling wine business. The last years of the 1970s saw another Anderson Valley grape grower become involved in the winemaking business. Lazy Creek Vineyards and Greenwood Ridge Vineyards began producing estate bottled wines from their own grapes. The Greenwood Ridge Vineyards were the vineyards on Vinegar Hill, Greenwood Ridge, that Tony Hush had planted originally. In 1979, Anderson Valley began a tradition of hosting the Mendocino County Fair Wine Competition, where wines produced from grapes grown in Mendocino County are judged by a panel of wine experts. Another milestone was passed in 1979 when Tony and Gretchen Hoff sold their winery to the Oswald family. The Oswald were already in the Mendocino County grape growing business with extensive vineyards planted at La Ribera Ranch in Talmadge. The 1980s saw expansion of Anderson Valley wineries on a scale that would have seemed almost impossible a decade earlier. During the early 80s, wineries seemed to have spring up little, like sugar, like mushrooms, all over California. And Anderson Valley was one of the exceptions. Handley Cellars, Christine Woods Vineyards, Pullman Vineyards, Pepperwood Springs Vineyards all began producing wine during those years. Pepperwood Springs was in some ways typical of the new wineries. Larry and Nikki Parsons, who bought their little hillside vineyard land in 1980 and had turned to winemaking as a way of making the most of their wine grapes, they got the name of a winery from Springs that had been developed for livestock that was grazed on their land during the Depression of the 1930s. That wasn't typical about the thing. What wasn't typical about Pepperwood Springs was that winemaker Larry Parsons was blind. He may have been blind, but he was a very good winemaker. Pepperwood Springs won design awards for its labels, but today they were also unique in that they contained rail riding. The small family winery vineyard attracted a lot of attention in the news media because of Larry's blindness. In 1986, Larry was killed in a traffic accident, and ownership of Pepperwood Springs was eventually transferred to Gary and Phyllis Kaler. Recalling one of the more unusual aspects of their pioneer efforts, Nikki Parsons remembered that Larry often had to jumpstart their 1938 vintage tractor while she towed it with their pickup truck. She also recalled that they got plenty of help and helpful advice from the neighboring winemakers. An important moment in Anderson Valley wine history took place in 1981 when the French firm Champagne, Louis Roederer, announced his plan to build a California sparkling wine facility in Anderson Valley. Valley Grapes had been going into sparkling wines production for several years. In fact, Schaffenberger, Cellars of Lucaya, and several other Mendocino County producers had selected Anderson Valley as the area ideally suited for growing top-notch Chardonnay and Pinot Noir for their sparkling wines. But Roederer's decision to locate his vineyard and sparkling wine production facilities gave a big boost to Anderson Valley's prestige as a premium wine growing area. So these pioneer winemakers of the last century would have a difficult time understanding how their modest efforts to start tradition that would ultimately see Anderson Valley recognized as one of the California's finest wine growing areas, like a highway that runs through the valley. Getting to this point in the valley's viticulture history has taken some ups and downs and a few twists and turns, but the results of those years of work have proved well and worth effort. And that's about it. I tried to get a hold of Courtney, who's the wine grower president, but I didn't. And at this point in history, I have no idea how many wineries there are in Anderson Valley or how many vineyards or how many acres. But Christine did pick up a map, one of the new maps, and I think you can probably, you can look at it and get some answers for yourselves. So
Eileen,
yeah.
What prompted you to do this?
When I went to work for Alan, he was working on it. And Marianne McClintock was already, she and I were his first two employees, and Pat Daniels was in on it. And so we were asked to go to the county and get copies of all the deeds. And those were called patents. And they were all homestead patents for the whole Greenwood Ridge. And we did. And the first person that we had hired to write the article for us took everything. She got back to us. She'd become ill, and she gave us back our notes. She never gave us back the patents. And we asked her several times, and she said, but you never gave them to us. But all three of us knew we did because we'd gone through them with her. And so I went back to the county to start all over again. And they said the microfiche was getting so worn that they'd sent them all to Sacramento. So if I wanted it again, I had to go through a title company. So.
And so, did you write this then?
I got notes. I had notes, Pat had notes, and then Neil Bell, who was worked for Mendocino College, he did the actual writing for us.
Okay.
Yeah.
Beautifully done.
And I forgot my glasses, so I could
Quite well. Eileen, you probably remember my dad telling this story of during Prohibition, that they would go out to Vinegar Hill and get jugs of wine and go to Hagerman's to the big dances.
Yeah.
And because it was Prohibition, everybody had to hide their jugs of wine in the brush. And he said if you threw a rock out through there, all you'd hear is clink, clink, clink. Had a jug.
Yeah?
Eileen, I'd like to know, the original up on Vinegar Ridge, none of those vineyards were irrigated, right? They were all dry
No, they were all
farm?
dry farm because, and then that's just really funny because when Dr. DePratt bought our vineyard, the first thing that they did is they went in and they trellised it and they put irrigation on it and almost killed it.
I picked in that vineyard, and when we picked there in the 70s, they said that the vines went down 80 feet,
Yeah.
and it was dry farmed at that point.
They will grow a grape, according to the books that Alan had down there at the winery, grapevines will send their roots down 100 feet looking for water. Jeez, I said no way. Morgan?
Yeah, so what happened was in the 1912, people would come into Elk, hop on the train, and go up Greenwood Creek, the 12 miles up Maple Basin to basically your place, and then go down into Hageman's.
No, not really. They had
Expand
hand,
on that a little bit. I know Maple Basin real well.
I know you do. Yeah, the trellis was still there till not too long ago. They had hand cars, and the employee,
Oh my God.
yeah, and that's how they went up and down. There was no passenger service. It was the employees would come up on the hand cars and they'd leave them there over the weekend while they went in, stopped. And there was Angela's folks was the first house, and then there was the juicy place, and then you go on down, you had the Joe Benettis and the Tobanis and so on, and they go back to Hagerman's, and I guess they just camped out in the woods, and
There was a place where the 3 or 4 roads go out. One goes to Devil's Kitchen, one goes up to Beacon Ridge. And somebody told me there was 1,000 people living in that place. We called it the Oil Shacks.
I honestly don't know,
That's
but,
right by Barry's.
but I know that Angelo could might be able to tell you more about that. He, he often walked down through the camp when they were kids, and they fished all the way down Greenwood Creek. But I've never been told how many people lived down there, but the Philbrooks had a mill here, and they had another one down there in Maple Basin. I don't know if you remember it or not. And they had a big camp there where people lived. Or they had a fellow from Norway that stayed in the States for a while, and when Angelo was his boss for the Vital Lumber Company, he came up one morning and it was maybe 40 degrees and it was frosty, and he was going to drive out in the woods with Angelo, and I said, "Aren't you cold?" He says, "Cold? This is warm weather."
So when that was originally written, was it published, or how did people read it?
We gave it it was done for the museum. Well, Alan, we did it for the Wine Growers Association. And then Thelma Fair was working at the museum, and she wanted a copy of it for the museum, so that's how.
So it didn't really get wide distribution?
No, it didn't, and just recently I gave a copy to the Mendocino wine growers, because they wanted it for their history
So
too.
Christine says now it's in a book, maybe on this side.
Yeah, we have, this is a wonderful.
Yeah,
time
in the voice of
Andrew.
Andrew.
But, so part of what happened then is back in, I guess, the late 80s, early 90s, the Historical Society had books that they called sketches of Anderson Valley, and there were 4. And one of them has this entire article in it, but there are wonderful articles.
Oh, there sure are.
I brought some, and we sell all of those for $5. You can get each set.
What a good deal.
Yeah. So I will love to sell you some and help us get the word out. And we have lots of those, and they have wonderful stories in them. So that's where it is. And that's when Eileen, bless her heart, wasn't sure she was going to be here or not. She's the one that reminded us, well, if you just go get your sketches, it's all right there.
There was another, I reminded Brad Wiley this when he recently wrote the article for the AVA about old vineyards. And it's long lost, but since I was involved at Clearwater, Leo and Edna Sanders had a vineyard down there. I know because I mowed the field and it's still got the humps from the plants.
Where was it, Morgan?
Right down Clearwater's Road. It was probably 4 or 5 acres.
There was a spot on here I missed, I guess I flipped too fast, but Alva Ingram said that there, in his remembrance, somewhere around Philo, there was a 120-acre vineyard. But he couldn't, that's all he could remember. So that might have been the one he was talking about.
Well, how about up Nash Mill Road, at the, I don't know what you call that, right-hand turn that goes up to Henry Hollow? There was a vineyard up there way back. Can anybody help me on that one? The place is at the top of the hill there, on the left. There's a pond there and a Peterman's place, that's right. Wasn't there a vineyard there a long time ago? Anybody know?
I honestly don't know. I do know that Hanley had a vineyard out there somewhere, but I don't know just where it was.
Eileen, I'm interested in the thing about wine growing that always seemed most attractive to me was living with the cycles, now it's, dormant, now it's a bud, now, it's like watching children grow. So I wondered, as a person who was involved in growing grapes, your personal kind of thoughts on that, because it can be so heartbreaking,
Oh, you mean the cycle?
Yeah, you as a wine grower, just how you experience the cycle of the grape year.
Well, the first year that we were married, 1949, is the year that Angela and I pulled out all those infidel at the home place, because every year the frost was getting it. In the early days, they hadn't had that much frost, but as the climate was changing even then, they were getting early frost, and it would wipe all the blossoms out, and that was it, or the early grapes. Across the road on the side where we live, there was a white grape vineyard, and it didn't get pulled out until sometime in the 70s, late 60s or 70s. And there again, for many years, it never got frosted, but eventually it got to the point where it was being frosted every year. So we pulled that one out. But the one up on top of the hill, as I say, my nephews own it now, and they're planting grapes. They're not pulling anything out.
So do you think over the long haul, given the losses and the gains, that you kind of broke even on grapes, or is there?
Very seldom. This is really funny. When Tom and Michelle Krieg and Tom's parents owned the vineyard, Tom asked me if I had any old records of prices. And I said, yeah, somewhere I've got some. So I dug them out for him and I gave them to him. And one year, and this was shortly before we sold it. Now, we sold it in 1976. So it was probably 72, 73 along there. We got a whole $42 a pound. I was $42 a ton for the grapes. The next year, we got 400 and something a ton for grapes. That's when the wine industry changed. That's the year that Ed Mead's made the prize-winning Ed Mead's, and we also sold half the crop to Ridge Vineyards in Los Altos Hills, and both Ed Mead's and Ridge Vineyards won double gold awards on the Zinfandel that year. So, yeah. So
Eileen, also, I know that you were an ex-banker. So how much involved was the First National Bank of Cloverdale, of which we had a branch here in Boonville? Was the banks, West America, but how much were they involved in financing vineyards, and what role did they play?
I don't know of anything early on. The main financing that was going to take place was when they closed. And there was, yes, we had a lot of loans on the book that we were getting ready to pay out, but they got mad because they wouldn't stay open late, and they were moving everything to Ukiah, and so they changed everything to the savings bank. Yeah.
Eileen, you keep talking about, when you were reading, you were mentioning the name Fratty and Old Foundry. Well, red wine is Fratty and Moonlight.
Yeah, Fratty Shams.
So that's where it came from.
Yeah, that's Angelo's aunt and uncle.
Okay.
Yeah.
Seaforth is white wine.
Well, I would just add one thing about the wine growers. Our curators are now working with the Wine Growers Association to put a nice exhibit back in the Tuttle building.
I think that's great, yes, yeah. And you?
Yeah, I'm wondering what a hand cart is for transportation.
Okay, it looks like this, it's flat, it's got wheels, 4 wheels on it, it runs on railroad tracks, and it's got a crank here. You have a guy at each end and he pumps it, one, right, like a teeter-totter.
You think that you could get a DUI when you're loaded?
I wasn't around then.
Probably pretty safe.
I'm sorry?
It's easier to keep it on the tracks at least.
I guess, I don't know. Anyway, my fireplace and irons are railroad tracks from that railroad. And up until, I don't know, about 4 years ago, Morgan, you worked down in there, that trestle was still up. And it was quite a sight to see.
Barely.
Yeah.
And you could still see what railroad spikes. I got a view of a little narrow gauge railroad with little short spikes like that. This whole railroad grade, the whole grade all the way to the coast, so it's like 4% uphill from you coming to the coast, and then if you're full of wine, you just coast.
Remind me what grappa is.
Grappa is a brandy made from grapes. In fact, I still got a bottle of Rob Giuliani's in my pantry.
It's an Italian cheap, it's a cheap Italian, with a liqueur, but it's what they, the winemakers and the pickers would take all the, after they squeezed everything out from the grapes, that's how it used to be in Italy. They take that and they distill it, and that is, it's a cheap booze for the workers.
Kind of unfiltered and just very...
Yeah, they would filter it some, but not much.
It's distilled.
It is distilled,
Yeah.
yeah. It's supposedly from the residue from pressing the grapes. It was the workers' cheap booze. One name that isn't mentioned in there that I just wanted everybody to be aware of is one of the reasons that Darren and Meats and his dad did so well was because of Jed Steele. Jed Steele was one of the leading winemakers first in the valley way back when, and then he went on to Kendall Jackson and got into a rights war with Kendall Jackson, but then he had his own. I think he still does. I think he sold it now. He's but he was over in Lake County with some very famous wines.
Right. Yeah, he had won the suit against Kendall Jackson because other winemakers came to his defense because Kendall Jackson said that when he went out on his own, he stole their formula. And he said there is no formula to winemaking. It's all in your smell and your taste.
And your technique, yeah. And one of the incredible wines that Jed did was in, it's been 79 because I still had the drive-in. And they had terrible rain at the end of the season, remember that year? And everything got really, really wet. And so Jed came up with this wine called rain wine. And it was actually the grapes that had gone bad, they went through and picked them, and he made a white rain wine. In fact, I saw a bottle of it that you never want to open up. In the last 10 years, there was one taken around the valley.
Was it a dessert wine?
No, it was not a dessert wine, but he was one of the best Gewürztraminer. One of the best Gewürztraminers that used to come out of the valley was from Jed. They'd do the old Gewürz. So that was a good time.
Wasn't there ice wine too? There was an ice wine.
Maybe he did the ice wine after that, but there was the rain wine. I remember they made a special label called the rain wine. But
yeah, I remember that, and also the whale wine. The whale wine. Yeah.
The whale wines. Yeah. But
Yeah, my son was in college, and he came home with a bunch of his buddies, and they went wine tasting, and they went down to Ed Mead's, and the Zinfandel had. The whale, was it the Zinfandel was it the Cabernet? But whichever one.
It might have been the Zin. Well, I don't remember. You got me
it was the Zin, and I'm not sure which one of the labels it was under. Yeah. Anyway, Gary was tasting it, and Eileen Marybin was, she was a part owner, and she was working the tasting room that day. And she said, Gary said, well, I'd really like to buy a bottle, but at $50, I can't afford it. So he says, how much is it? And she says, $50. He says, holy cats, I sweat blood in that vineyard for the last 20 years, and I'd have to pay $50 to get a bottle. So she gave him a bottle.
So I got a rainbow ring a bell for me because I also picked it, Duprat's, right? And remember the truck that tipped over?
Oh,
Yeah, you pick up the story. We-
Oh, jeez.
Go ahead.
Darren, we were picking, this was early on, and not too many Mexican folks had showed up. It wasn't
Yeah,
a
and
big
those-
enough deal back
yeah.
then, so they were desperate for pickers, so, you know, us hippies, they had to hire us. It was Yeah, and we had a lot of fun. We had great fights, and we were, well, I don't know, this is you're grown-up crowd. We'd take off our clothes. Anyway, we had a good time, man. But this one day at DuPrat, the big gondola truck was coming. And they were, boy, when they had the whip going on, and said, hurry up, pick it, we got to get all the bins. There were 23 bins of grapes that we filled up with these grapes, and we worked really hard.
Yeah, I can
We
imagine.
were sweating, it was a hot day, and here comes the gondola truck, and we're sitting down. Well, the tractor that had the forklift on it that lifted it up and dumped it in the gondola was broke. And they looked at us and they said, you gotta load that gondola truck. So we, with our hands, dug into the bins, which the bees had discovered, and we got stung right in the soft part of our thing. And we loaded buckets, and we had a bucket per grade, and we loaded a whole gondola truck by hand. And then the truck drives off, and we were exhausted. We went, oh man, that's it. And then, I don't know who was the bull of the woods then, but they said, get back to work, start picking it. What? About 20 minutes later, Darren's wife comes back, and she says, the gondola truck tipped over on Greenwood Road, and it's blocked. The grapes are blocking the road. You have to go down there. We're like, what?
Right by Frank's Firewood.
Yeah, right. And we went down, and sure enough, there was this wall of grapes. The guy didn't get hurt. He lost his brakes. He drove it up on the bank. The gondola tipped over, and there were all the grapes in the road. And with pitchforks, we off the road, we picked them up one more time. Put them in the gondola. I don't know what Darren called those. Maybe asphalt grapes, or I don't know, twisting grapes. I don't know if he had a name for them, but man, that was really something. Yeah, thank you.
Oh, what a story.
And they did work, actually.
Oh, God, that was
Well,
funny.
a lot of people probably have lots of stories.
Must have been a surprise.
You were young the other day.
Thank you very much.